It was my first year of college, and I could hardly wait to start this new chapter of my life. I had just finished unpacking all my stuff in my dorm room, and my family had just left. The silence that lingered after they were gone was almost palpable, as if the room was waiting for something or someone to fill it. Later that same day, my roommate finally showed up. From the moment he walked into the room, carrying a worn-out backpack and a small suitcase, I could tell he was different. It wasn't just his disheveled appearance or the hesitant way he moved. There was something in the air around him. Like, he carried a heavy, uncomfortable energy with him. I introduced myself as Dan, extending my hand for a handshake. He paused, looked at my hand as if he didn't understand at first, then let out a short, awkward laugh and said, "Oh," before giving me a limp handshake, like he was holding a dead fish. I had to ask for his name since he didn't bother to offer it when we shook hands. "Dale," he replied, almost whispering as if he was afraid I'd hear him. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was from, if he was excited for classes, the usual stuff. But he only responded with yes or no, occasionally laughing or smiling awkwardly, like he didn't know what to do with his own face. Within minutes, we were both sitting on our beds, each on our laptops, not saying a word to each other. I was annoyed. This wasn't exactly the start I'd envisioned for my college life. I was already planning to request a different roommate. Anyone would be better than Dale, I thought. He was just a really weird guy, but I soon learned he was much more than that. That night, after exploring the campus and meeting some people on my floor, I returned to the dorm. Dale was still in the same position he'd been in when I left, sitting on his bed with his laptop open, the screen's glow reflecting off his pale face. I said, "What's up, Dale?" And he didn't respond, which didn't surprise me. It was 9:30. I didn't have anything to do, so I turned off the light on my side of the room and lay down. But sleep didn't come easily. Dale stayed on his laptop until 3 a.m., the blue light flickering intermittently, like he was typing something frantically. When he finally closed the laptop, the room plunged into darkness, and I fell asleep almost immediately, but not for long. I woke up less than an hour later with a chill down my spine that I couldn't explain. The blinds in our room were open, and moonlight streamed through the window, casting an eerie glow over everything. That's when I saw him. Dale was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring right at me. His eyes gleamed in the dark, and he didn't blink, like he was studying me, analyzing my every move. I sat up abruptly, rubbed my eyes, and said, my voice still thick with sleep, "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" He whispered back, almost apologetically, "Sorry," and then lay down, turning his back to me. The next morning, I woke up to find Dale already gone. It felt like the first time he'd left the room, but the image of him sitting on the bed staring at me in the middle of the night was burned into my mind. Something about that scene wasn't right, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time Dale left me with a deep sense of unease. The next day, I woke up early, the image of Dale sitting on the bed, staring at me in the dark, still fresh in my mind. He wasn't in the room, and I felt relieved to have some time alone. I decided to explore the campus and meet more people on my floor. After all, it was my first day of orientation, and I wanted to start making friends. As I walked through the dorm hallways, I met some classmates who seemed cool. They were excited, talking about the parties happening that weekend and the classes they were taking. It was exactly the kind of energy I'd hoped for in college, but in the back of my mind there was still that nagging feeling about Dale. During orientation, as our group walked through the campus gardens, I overheard two students whispering and laughing. "What's that guy doing over there?" one of them asked, pointing behind a bush. I looked in the direction they were pointing, and to my surprise, it was Dale. He was literally sitting on the ground behind some bushes, rubbing the bark of a tree with his hand. His fingers moved slowly, like he was trying to feel every detail of the tree's texture. He didn't seem to notice the group passing by or the orientation leader, who was enthusiastically talking about the university's history. If she'd seen Dale, I'm sure she would have said something, but no one else seemed to care. I just walked past without saying anything. I didn't want to draw attention to him, or to myself, for being his roommate. But that scene stuck in my head. What was he doing? Why was he acting like that? It was like he was in another world, completely oblivious to what was happening around him. Later, during a break in orientation, I ended up telling the two students who'd seen Dale about him. "He's my roommate," I said awkwardly, like I was apologizing for him. They glanced at each other and laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, like they weren't sure if it was okay to laugh or not. "Good luck with that," one of them said, and I laughed along, but it was forced. Deep down, I was starting to wonder if Dale was just weird, or if there was something more sinister behind his behavior. I became friends with those two students, and we agreed to meet up later to explore the campus together. When I returned to the dorm that night, Dale was there, sitting in the same position I'd left him in hours earlier, with his laptop open on his lap. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "Hey, Dale," I said, trying to be polite. "How was your day?" He glanced up for a second like he was processing the question, then replied with a simple, "Good." And that was it. No follow-up, no asking about my day. Just that heavy silence again. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling he gave me. That's when I noticed something strange. My laptop was unlocked, and I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. When I looked closer, I saw that all my emails were open, emails I hadn't even read yet, and several of my folders had been accessed. My heart raced. "Dale," I said, trying to stay calm. "Did you mess with my laptop?" "Calculated." He replied almost immediately, louder than usual. "No." I knew he looked at me, and for the first time I saw something different in his expression. It wasn't fear or guilt, but something more. Lying. The way he answered, almost like he'd rehearsed it, made me even more uneasy. But what could I do? I didn't have proof, and confronting him directly felt risky. I decided to let it go, at least for now. That night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't relax. The feeling that Dale had invaded my privacy going through my things left me unsettled. And worse, I couldn't stop thinking about what else he might have done, or what he might still do. The next morning, I woke up to find Dale already gone. It was a relief, but it also put me on edge. What was he doing? Where was he going? I couldn't stop thinking about that calculated look on his face when I confronted him about the laptop. It was like he was playing a game and I didn't know the rules. Later, as I was organizing my things, I noticed something odd. My clothes in the closet seemed different. It wasn't obvious, but I was sure my shirts were in a different order than I'd left them. And my sock drawer, which I always kept organized, was a mess. My heart started racing. Had he gone through my clothes too? I looked over at Dale's bed where his backpack was tossed haphazardly. Part of me wanted to go through his things to give him a taste of his own medicine, but I couldn't. There was something about him that stopped me, like I was afraid of what I might find, or what he might do if he found out. That night, I decided to leave the room and hang out with the two friends I'd made during orientation. I needed some time away from Dale, even if it was just for a few hours. When I returned, he was sitting at the desk facing the door like he'd been waiting for me. "Hey, what's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out tighter than I wanted. "Nothing," he replied, too quickly like he'd rehearsed it. He didn't look away, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop, trying to distract myself. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. My browsing history was full of sites I'd never visited. Some of them were completely random. Pages about appliance repairs, forums discussing exotic plants, even a site about wilderness survival techniques. What the hell was Dale looking for? I glanced at him, but he had his back to me, typing something on his own laptop. He seemed absorbed, like he was completely immersed in whatever he was doing. I wanted to confront him again, to ask what he'd been doing on my computer, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of finding out the truth. I decided to go to bed early that night, hoping sleep would help me forget everything, even if just for a few hours. But as soon as I turned off the light, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of a zipper being slowly pulled open, coming from my bag on the floor next to the bed. My heart raced. I knew it was Dale. He was going through my things again. I sat up and turned on the light, this time determined to confront him once and for all. "Dale, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and fear. He stopped rummaging through the bag and looked at me with a blank expression, almost like he didn't understand why I was upset. "I think you took my toothbrush by mistake," he said in a monotone voice, like he was reciting a line. I stared at him, incredulous. "Seriously, Dale? You're going through my bag in the middle of the night over a toothbrush?" He didn't respond. He just looked at me with those empty eyes, then got up and went to his bed, like nothing had happened. At that moment, I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. Dale wasn't just weird, he was dangerous, and I needed to get out of that room before something worse happened. The next day, I woke up determined to fix the situation. I couldn't take living with Dale anymore. Every minute in that room felt like torture, and I knew I needed to get out before something worse happened. I went to the housing office and explained the situation. I didn't go into too much detail, just said my roommate was troublesome and that I didn't feel safe. The staff member seemed to understand and assured me they'd find me a new room as soon as possible. In the meantime, I decided to spend as little time in the dorm as possible. I spent the day exploring campus, studying in the library, and hanging out with the two friends I'd made. They noticed I was quieter than usual, but I didn't want to talk about Dale. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? By late afternoon, I got a message saying my new room was ready. It was in the same building but on a different floor. I couldn't wait to move. I went back to the dorm to grab my things, and to my relief, Dale wasn't there. I packed everything as quickly as I could, trying not to think about what he'd do if he came back and saw me leaving. My new roommate was a guy named Chris. He was quiet, but seemed normal. Nothing like the nightmare that was Dale. I briefly explained that I'd had issues with my old roommate, and he just nodded like he understood. That night, after a decent conversation with Chris, we both turned off the lights and went to sleep. For the first time in days, I felt safe, but the relief didn't last long. For the third night in a row, I woke up at a strange hour, my heart pounding in my chest. This time it wasn't a dream or a weird feeling that woke me. It was a sound. A soft, intermittent clicking noise coming from near the door. I lay there, frozen, trying to figure out what it was. The sound wasn't consistent, but I heard it at least twice every 30 seconds, like someone was trying to do something quietly and failing. I got up slowly, trying not to make noise. Chris was still asleep, so I knew the sound wasn't coming from him. My feet touched the cold floor, and I crept toward the door, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the other side. The hallway. Nightlight was always on, so when I looked through the peephole, I could see the top of someone's head standing outside our door. They were looking down, so I couldn't see their face, but something about the image sent a chill through me. Now that I was paying attention, I realized the clicking noises were coming from the doorknob. The person was trying to unlock the door. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I knew I had to do something, but my body felt frozen. Then I remembered I had the campus police number saved on my phone. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number. I explained the situation in a low voice, trying not to wake Chris, and the dispatcher assured me someone would be there right away. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I kept looking through the peephole, watching the person outside continue to fiddle with the doorknob. The clicking sound seemed to grow louder, like they were getting more impatient. Finally, I heard quick footsteps in the hallway and saw two campus police officers approaching. Only then did I feel safe enough to open the door. When I stepped out, I saw the officers handcuffing Dale. He didn't resist or say a word. He just looked at me with those empty eyes, like I was the stranger in the situation. I told the officers everything, how he'd been my old roommate, how he'd gone through my things, and how I'd moved rooms to get away from him. They took notes and led Dale away. One of the officers assured me he wouldn't bother me again, but even after they left, I couldn't stop shaking. What did Dale want? Why was he trying to get into my new room? And what would he have done if I hadn't woken up that night? After the police took Dale away, I expected to feel relieved. Finally, he was gone, and I could move on with my college life without that shadow hanging over me. But the relief never came. Instead, I was left with a strange feeling, like something was still unresolved. The next day, I went to the housing office to report what had happened. The staff member seemed shocked by the story but assured me Dale had been suspended for the semester, maybe even expelled. They didn't give me many details, but they said he wouldn't be a problem for me anymore. Chris, my new roommate, tried to comfort me. "Dude, what a weird situation," he said, "but at least it's over, right?" I agreed with him, but deep down I couldn't believe it was that simple. Dale didn't seem like the type to give up easily. The following days were normal. I went to class, hung out with my new friends, and tried to settle into the college routine. But every time I returned to the dorm, I found myself double-checking the hallway, like I expected to see Dale standing there, staring at me with those empty eyes. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard a clicking noise at the door. But it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or at least I hoped it was. Time passed and I never saw Dale again. No one on campus talked about him, and I didn't have the courage to ask, but he stayed in my head. I'd catch myself thinking about him at random moments during class in the dining hall, even when I was with my friends. What did he want? Why had he chosen me? And what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night? Years went by and I graduated from college. The experience with Dale faded into the past, but it never really disappeared. Sometimes I still have nightmares about him, dreams where he's standing outside my door trying to get in, or sitting on the edge of my bed staring at me in the dark. I wake up sweating, my heart racing, and it takes me a few seconds to convince myself it was just a dream. But the truth is, I'll never know what really happened with Dale. Was he just a disturbed kid, or was there something more sinister behind those empty eyes? Was he a predator, a stalker, or something I can't even name? I'll never have those answers, and maybe that's for the best. Now, when I tell this story, people laugh nervously, like it's just a scary story to spook others. But for me, it's not just a story, it was real. And even after all these years, I still feel a chill when I think about that night Dale tried to get into my room. He may have disappeared from my life, but he never disappeared from my mind. And sometimes, in my worst nightmares, I still see him, standing outside my door, waiting to come in. Two years ago, I was a student at Binghamton University. Back then, I had an amazing group of friends: Jake, my roommate, always the most outgoing of the group, and Emily, who was quieter but had a sharp sense of humor that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. Every weekend, we'd go out with a few other friends to enjoy college life, but that Friday night in October, the plan was different. Jake, Emily, and I decided to go to the nature reserve near the lake, a spot few students knew about. The nature reserve was one of those places that felt like it was straight out of a horror movie. The lake was dark and silent, reflecting the pale light of the full moon. The surrounding forest was dense with tall trees that seemed to lean over us, as if they were watching. There was a small clearing on the other side of the lake, far from campus security, where students would sometimes build bonfires, drink, and occasionally do things they shouldn't. We liked the spot because it was hidden and peaceful, or so we thought. That night we brought some beers, lit a bonfire, and sat around it, starting what Jake called a bro chat. The air was cold, but the fire kept us warm and the alcohol quickly kicked in. We laughed at everything, sharing funny stories and reminiscing about the absurd moments we'd experienced together. Emily nearly fell over laughing, and Jake, as usual, exaggerated the stories to make them even funnier. But even with all the fun, something about that night felt off. The silence of the forest was almost oppressive, like it was staring at us. The wind made the leaves whisper, and every now and then we'd hear the distant sound of branches snapping. Jake joked that we were in a horror movie, and we all laughed, but deep down I felt a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us. I looked at Emily and Jake, both illuminated by the flames, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then something changed. The sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping grew louder, closer. Jake suddenly stopped laughing and said, "Shh." We all fell silent, looking at each other, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I realized we weren't alone. Someone, or something, was in the forest with us. And that uneasy feeling I'd had all night? It was about to turn into pure terror. The fire continued to crackle, its flames lighting up our faces. Jake, Emily, and I sat around it, trying to ignore the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching in the distance. Jake, always the laid-back one, tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "Looks like the Blair Witch decided to show up tonight, huh?" Emily let out a nervous laugh, but I couldn't find it funny. Something about that forest wasn't right. The alcohol was still affecting our senses, but fear was starting to take over. Emily, who was usually the calmest in the group, looked at me with a worried expression. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, pointing into the darkness beyond the fire. We stopped laughing and listened. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone or something was moving in the forest, and it seemed to be getting closer. Jake tried to stay calm. "It's probably just an animal," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. I knew he was trying to reassure us, but the truth was none of us believed it. The sound was too human, and worse, it felt like we were being surrounded. The noise came from different directions, as if someone was walking in circles around our bonfire. Emily grabbed my hand, and I could feel how scared she was. "What if it's campus security?" she asked, trying to find a logical explanation. Jake shook his head. "At this hour? They never come this far into campus." He was right. That spot was practically unknown, and security rarely ventured out there, especially at night. Then we heard the first branch snap closer to us. The sound was so loud that we all jumped. Jake stood up, staring into the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to sound brave, but his voice cracked at the end. No one answered. Only the heavy silence of the forest enveloped us, as if we were being watched. I felt paralyzed, unable to move. The bonfire, which had kept us warm earlier, now felt like it was exposing us, making us easy targets for whatever was out there. Emily squeezed my hand tighter, and I knew she was thinking the same thing. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered, but before we could respond, it happened. A loud thud echoed through the clearing, and we all screamed. Something had been thrown into the fire, causing the flames to scatter. It was a huge branch, as if it had been ripped from a tree and hurled directly at us. Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with pure terror. "That wasn't an animal," he said, and I knew he was right. Before we could process what had happened, another branch flew toward us, hitting Jake in the face. He screamed in pain, falling to the ground. Emily and I helped him up, but fear had already taken hold of us. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing the backpack with the leftover beers. Jake, holding his face, nodded, and the three of us started running toward the dorm, leaving the bonfire behind. But even as we ran, I knew it wasn't over. The sound of footsteps chasing us through the forest was unmistakable. Someone or something was following us, and I had no idea what we'd do if it caught up. We ran through the forest, Jake holding his face where the branch had hit him, and Emily clutching my arm, nearly tripping with every step. The darkness was almost absolute, with only the moonlight filtering through the trees, casting shadows that seemed to move around us. The sound of footsteps behind us was constant, as if whoever or whatever was out there was hunting us. "Why the hell did we come out here?" Jake muttered, still holding his face. He was clearly scared but trying to keep his composure. Emily didn't say anything, just kept running beside me, her breath ragged in the silent night. I could barely think straight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise ahead of us, like something big had fallen to the ground. We stopped for a moment, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The forest felt alive, every sound making us more paranoid. Then we saw it. Something, or someone, moving between the trees ahead of us. It was just a dark silhouette, but it was too big to be an animal. Jake looked at me, his eyes full of panic. "We need to get out of here now," he said, and I agreed. But where would we go? We were completely lost in that cursed forest. We decided to keep running toward the dorm, but the footsteps behind us seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, Jake stopped abruptly, almost causing Emily and me to crash into him. "What is it?" I asked, panting. He pointed to something on the ground ahead of us. It was another branch, but this one was covered in blood. "What the hell is going on?" Emily screamed, her voice echoing through the forest. I didn't have an answer. Fear was taking over and I could barely think straight. Then we heard a sound that made us freeze in place, a laugh. It was low and distant but unmistakably human, and it was coming from all directions at once. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice shaking. No one answered. The laughter continued, echoing through the forest as if it was surrounding us. Emily started crying, clinging to me tighter. I knew we needed to get out of there, but it felt like no matter where we ran, that sound would follow us. Then we saw the figure again. This time it was closer, standing between the trees, staring right at us. It was tall and thin, with long arms that seemed disproportionate to its body. We couldn't see its face, but we could feel its gaze fixed on us, as if it was studying us. "Let's go!" I shouted, pulling Emily and Jake with me. We ran as if our lives depended on it, because in that moment, it felt like they did. The figure didn't follow us immediately, but the laughter continued, echoing in our minds even as we finally reached the road leading back to the dorm. When we stopped to catch our breath, we looked back at the forest. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. As a car passed by on the road, it disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of being watched never left us. That night, none of us could sleep properly. The laughter still echoed in our minds, and the image of that figure haunted us. We knew something horrible had happened in that forest, and we had no idea what it was. But one thing was certain: we would never go back there after dark. After reaching the road that separated the forest from the dorm, Jake, Emily, and I stopped to catch our breath. Our hearts were pounding so hard it felt like they might burst out of our chests. The night was cold, but sweat dripped down my face, mixed with the adrenaline and fear that still consumed us. We looked back toward the forest, and that's when we saw it. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the forest, motionless like a statue. Even from a distance, we could feel its gaze fixed on us. It was tall and thin, with long arms hanging at its sides. We couldn't see its face, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Emily started crying softly, clinging to my arm. "What does it want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake, still holding his face where the branch had hit him, looked at me with an expression of pure terror. "It doesn't matter what it wants. We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice hoarse and full of fear. I nodded, but before we could move, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the road. It was her. The figure was moving toward us, slowly, as if it was hunting us. Its footsteps were heavy, echoing on the empty road. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Emily and Jake with me. We ran toward the dorm, but the footsteps behind us seemed to be getting closer. When we finally reached the dorm, we looked back one more time. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, watching us. As a car passed by, its headlights illuminating the road, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. But we knew it had. We knew it had followed us. We climbed the dorm, stairs in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached our floor, we found Sarah, another friend from the group, waiting for us. She looked scared but also relieved to see us. "Where were you guys? I was worried," she said, hugging Emily. We didn't say anything. We just went into Jake's room and sat on the floor, trying to process what had happened. We looked out the window toward the forest. The figure was there, pacing back and forth at the edge of the trees. Every time a car passed, it would disappear into the trees, only to reappear when the road was empty again. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, looking at us with an expression of pure terror. No one answered. None of us had an answer. We only knew that something horrible had happened in that forest, and that figure, whatever it was watching us. Finally, after hours of silence and fear, the figure disappeared for good. But the feeling of being watched never left us. That night, none of us could sleep properly. The image of that figure haunted us, and we knew we would never be the same after that experience. The next morning, Jake, Emily, Sarah, and I gathered in the dorm common room. The daylight brought temporary relief, but the weight of the previous night was still etched in our minds. No one had slept well. The dark circles under Emily's eyes and her red, puffy eyes were silent testimony to the terror we'd endured. Jake, with a bruise on his face where the branch had hit him, seemed quieter than usual, as if he was reliving every moment in the forest. "So, what exactly happened?" Sarah asked, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. She hadn't been with us in the forest, but the look on our faces was enough to make her understand that something horrible had happened. I looked at Jake and Emily, hesitating for a moment before I started to explain. I described the sounds we'd heard, the branches being thrown at us, the figure in the forest, and the chase back to the dorm. As I spoke, I saw Sarah's face pale, and she crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself from the story. "And you have no idea what that was?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Jake replied, looking at the floor. "But it wasn't human. At least not entirely. The way it moved, it was wrong. And that laugh." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We'd all heard it. That low, distant laugh still echoed in our minds like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Emily, who had been quiet most of the time, finally spoke. "What if it's still out there? What if it's waiting for us?" Her voice was a whisper, but the words seemed to scream in our ears. No one answered. The truth was, none of us wanted to think about the possibility that the figure was still out there. We decided we'd never go back to the forest after dark. The place that had once been our secret refuge was now a constant reminder of the terror we'd experienced. Even during the day, we avoided looking in the direction of the nature reserve, as if just looking at it might attract that thing's attention. In the days that followed, we tried to move on. We laughed about the situation as if it was just a scary story to tell at parties. But deep down, we knew it wasn't just a story. Something real and horrifying had happened that night, and none of us could explain what it was. Years have passed since that night, and each of us has gone our separate ways. Jake moved to another city, Emily started working at a hospital, and I continued my studies at another university. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear that low, distant laugh. And whenever I look at a forest, I feel a chill down my spine, as if that figure is still out there, watching, waiting. We never found out what that thing in the forest was. Maybe it was a spirit, a ghost, or something worse. What matters is that it marked us forever. And to this day, none of us can forget the night we faced the unknown and lived to tell the story. I moved into the dorm at the University of Iowa at the start of fall, eager to begin my freshman year. The campus was huge, and I was still getting used to college life. My roommate, a guy named Ethan, seemed laid back at first glance. He was a dedicated runner, always in his running shoes and athletic gear. Ethan had a calm, almost introspective demeanor, and spent most of his time studying or going out for runs, even on chilly nights. On the first night, I was organizing my things in the room when I heard a soft knock at the door. It was late and the hallway was quiet. I assumed it was Ethan, maybe forgetting his key or needing something. "Come in," I called out, but there was no response. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I got up from my chair, slightly annoyed, and opened the door. The hallway was completely empty, lit only by the faint glow of fluorescent lights. "Ethan?" I called, my voice echoing down the hall. Nothing. Just the heavy silence of the dorm at night. I closed the door, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had started to settle in the pit of my stomach. Later, when Ethan returned from his run, I asked if he had knocked on my door earlier. He looked at me with a confused expression. "No, I was running on the other side of campus. Why?" I just shook my head, saying I must have imagined it. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't get the sound of those knocks out of my head. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there watching, waiting. The following nights were a nightmare. The knocks on my door started happening more frequently, always around the same time, around 11 p.m. I was starting to lose my patience. Ethan, my roommate, kept going out for runs at that hour, so I couldn't rely on him to witness what was happening. One night, I decided to leave the door slightly ajar while I studied. If someone was trying to mess with me, I'd catch them in the act. I positioned my chair facing the door with a clear view of the hallway and buried myself in my books. For a while, everything was quiet. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint rustling of the wind against the window. Then, the knocks started again. This time they were more insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I looked toward the door, expecting to see someone, but the hallway remained empty. The knocks grew louder, each one more forceful than the last. My heart started to race, and a sense of dread washed over me. "If you're out there, come in," I shouted, my voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But then, I heard it again. This time, the knocks were softer, almost like a whisper, as if someone was trying to communicate delicately but persistently. My heart pounded. I stood up slowly, approaching the door with cautious steps. I gripped the doorknob, feeling the cold metal under my hand, and opened the door just enough to peek into the hallway. Nothing, just the dim light and the silent emptiness. I closed the door quickly, pressing my back against it as if it could protect me from something I couldn't even see. Ethan returned shortly after, sweaty and out of breath from his run. I didn't say anything to him. How could I explain something I didn't even understand? But that night, as I tried to sleep, I swore I heard a whisper coming from the corner of the room. It was almost imperceptible, but the words echoed in my mind. "Help me." I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I needed to tell someone, so I decided to talk to my friend Emily, who lived in the dorm next door. She was the type who believed in supernatural stuff, so I figured she wouldn't judge me. "Emily, you're going to think I'm losing it, but something weird is happening in my room," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper. She looked at me with interest, her green eyes sparkling under the hallway light. "Tell me everything," she replied without hesitation. I described the knocks, the whispers, and the feeling that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with me. Emily was silent for a moment, as if processing every word. Then she made a suggestion that sent chills down my spine. "Maybe you should try talking to it. Ask what it wants." That night I was alone in the room. Ethan was at a study group and wouldn't be back until late. The lights were off, and I was sitting on my bed, waiting. The clock read 10:58 p.m. My heart was racing, and my hands were sweaty. I knew the knocks would come, and then they did. This time they were faster, more frantic, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was desperate. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and shouted, "If someone's out there, please show yourself. I'm not afraid." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. And then, the response came. A soft, almost feminine voice whispered, "Help me." My entire body froze. The voice didn't come from the door. It seemed to come from all around, as if it was in the air itself. "What do you need help with?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was a pause, and then the voice replied, even softer, "I need to be heard." The knocks returned, louder and more frantic than ever. It felt like the entire room was vibrating with their intensity. My heart pounded in sync with the noise, and I felt a heavy, almost palpable energy filling the air. I knew this wasn't a prank. Something real, something beyond human understanding, was trying to communicate with me. And for the first time, I felt like I had no choice but to listen. After that night, I knew I needed help. I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I decided to talk to the RA, resident advisor on my floor, a girl named Sarah, who always seemed level-headed and trustworthy. She had a calm, professional demeanor, and I hoped she wouldn't think I was completely crazy. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something weird," I said hesitantly, as she organized some papers on her desk. She looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Weird how?" I took a deep breath and started explaining everything, the knocks, the whispers, the voice asking for help. To my surprise, Sarah didn't laugh or look at me like I was making things up. Instead, she grew serious, almost concerned. "You're not the first person to report something like this," she said, lowering her voice. "There are stories about a ghost haunting this dorm. They say it's a student who died here years ago. He never graduated, and ever since, he's been wandering the halls trying to be heard." A chill ran down my spine. "So, you think this is real?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know if I believe it, but I know a lot of people have had similar experiences. If you want my opinion, maybe he just wants someone to listen to him." It made sense in a disturbing way. That night, I decided to try something different. Instead of ignoring the knocks or yelling for them to stop, I left a note in my room, handwritten. "I hear you. What do you want to tell me?" I placed the note on the desk along with a glass of water as a symbolic offering. I didn't know if it would make a difference, but I had to try. The next morning, the note was exactly where I left it, but the glass of water had been knocked over. The water was spilled across the desk as if someone or something had deliberately hit it. I stood there staring at the scene, trying to process what it meant. In the nights that followed, I kept leaving notes, always with simple messages. "I'm here," or "You're not alone." The knocks started to fade and the atmosphere in the room felt less heavy. It was as if the spirit was calming down, finally feeling like someone was listening. The next few weeks were strangely peaceful. The knocks stopped completely and the room felt lighter, as if an oppressive presence had finally dissipated. Even Ethan commented on the change. "The room feels more calm lately," he said one morning as he laced up his running shoes. I just nodded, not explaining what had happened. How could I? I was still trying to process it all. One night, as I was organizing my desk to study, I found something that left me frozen. It was a note, but it wasn't one of mine. The handwriting was thin and delicate, almost as if it had been written with minimal pressure. The message was short, but clear. "Thank you for listening." My heart raced. I looked around the room, as if expecting to see someone, but I was alone. Ethan was at the library and the hallway was silent. That note shouldn't have been there. I didn't write it, and no one else had access to my room. I picked up the note with trembling hands, feeling a chill run down my spine. It was real. Someone or something had left that for me. In the nights that followed, there were no more knocks, whispers, or knocked over glasses. The room remained silent, and the atmosphere was peaceful. But even so, I couldn't forget that note. It stayed in my mind, a reminder that something supernatural had happened there. On the last day of the semester, as I packed my bags to leave, I found another note. This time it was on the bed, folded neatly. My hands shook as I opened it. The same thin, delicate handwriting read, "You helped me find peace. Good luck." I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Fear? Gratitude? Maybe a little of everything. I tucked the note into my backpack, a keepsake of that bizarre experience. When I closed the door to the room for the last time, I looked back, almost expecting to hear one final knock or whisper. But there was nothing, just silence. I never imagined that my college experience would be marked by something so bizarre and terrifying. My name is Emily, and at the time, I had just moved into the university dorm, an old building full of stories that upperclassmen loved to tell, to scare freshmen. At first, everything seemed normal. My room was on the 3rd floor and I shared the hallway with other students, like Sarah, a quiet girl studying biology, and Jake, an outgoing guy who always had headphones on. Even though the place was a bit gloomy with its peeling walls and flickering lights, I felt at home. It was during the 3rd week that things started to get weird. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the first knock on my door. A soft but persistent sound, like someone was trying to get my attention without disturbing others. I was lying in bed reading a book, and at first I thought it was Jake playing a prank. He was known for his questionable sense of humor. "Who is it?" I asked, trying. To hide the annoyance in my voice, no one answered. The knock stopped for a moment, then started again, a little louder this time. I sighed, got out of bed, and walked to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was completely empty. The dim light from the lamp at the end of the hall cast shadows, stretching across the walls, but there was no one in sight. "Jake, this isn't funny," I shouted, my voice echoing down the silent hallway. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind hitting the windows at the end of the hall. I closed the door, trying to ignore the chill running up my spine. I went back to bed, but I slept poorly that night with the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The next day, I asked Jake if he was responsible for the knocks. He denied it, with a genuinely confused expression on his face. "Wasn't me, Emily, I swear. Maybe it was Thomas. He loves pulling these creepy pranks," he suggested, referring to another guy on our floor. I went to Thomas's room, but he also denied it, seeming genuinely surprised by my question. Sarah, who was in the hallway at the time, said she hadn't heard anything that night. "Maybe you dreamed it," she suggested with a reassuring smile. But I knew it wasn't a dream. The knocks were real, and the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger by the minute. That night, I prepared for the worst, not knowing that this was just the first of many terrifying nights to come. The next night, I was determined not to let the knocks scare me again. I decided that if it happened again, I would confront whoever or whatever was behind it. Emily wasn't the type to hide, and I was tired of feeling afraid in my own room. Sarah, my neighbor down the hall, had lent me a cup of chamomile tea before bed, saying it would help me relax. Jake, as usual, was lost in his classic rock playlist with his headphones on, and Thomas was in his room playing video games, like always. The dorm seemed normal, but I knew something was about to change. It was around 3 a.m. when the knocks started again. This time they were louder, more insistent, as if whoever was on the other side was growing impatient. My heart raced, and I felt that familiar chill run up my spine. The lamp in the hallway seemed dimmer than usual, and the shadows on the walls stretched longer, as if they were reaching out toward me. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No one answered. The knocks continued, each one louder than the last. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This time, I wasn't going to ignore it. In one quick motion, I opened the door, ready to confront Jake, Thomas, or whoever it was. But once again, the hallway was empty. The light flickered slightly, and I felt a shiver run through my body. That's when I saw something that made me freeze. At the end of the hallway, a dark figure stood with its back to me. It was tall, with a hunched posture, like an elderly man. My instincts screamed at me to close the door and lock myself in my room, but something inside me pushed me forward. I needed to know who this person was. "Hey!" I shouted, starting to walk toward the figure. As soon as I took the first step, the figure began to move, disappearing around the corner of the hallway. I ran after it, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the end of the hall, all I saw was the bathroom door slowly closing. The doorknob stopped mid-turn as if someone was holding it from the inside. "Thomas, this isn't funny," I shouted, trying to mask the fear in my voice. No one answered. The bathroom door was slightly ajar now, and I knew I had to go in. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and turned on the light. The bathroom was empty except for a pair of heavy black boots on the floor under one of the stalls. They looked old, with thick, worn soles like they belonged to a laborer. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice echoing in the empty space. Nothing, just the sound of my heavy breathing. I approached the stall, looking under the door. The boots were there, but no one was inside them. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy laugh coming from somewhere nearby, but impossible to pinpoint. It sounded like the laugh of an old man, but there was something unsettling about it, almost inhuman. My heart raced, and I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. The knocks continued for a few more minutes, but I didn't have the courage to open the door again. That night, I knew something was wrong, and it wasn't a prank by Thomas or Jake. Something sinister was happening in the dorm, and I was at the center of it. The next morning, I was exhausted. The knocks and the figure in the hallway had left me in a constant state of alert, and I barely slept. Sarah noticed how worn out I looked during breakfast and asked if I was okay. Jake, sitting next to us, seemed distracted, but Thomas, who was passing by with a tray of food, stopped to look at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Emily," he joked. but his expression changed when he saw the seriousness on my face. "Someone was knocking on my door last night, and it wasn't a prank," I said, looking directly at him. Thomas frowned, seeming genuinely confused. "Wasn't me, I swear. And Jake was with me most of the night, playing video games." Jake nodded in agreement. But I didn't know who to trust anymore. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure out what it was. I decided that if the knocks came back that night, I wouldn't ignore them. I would face whatever was haunting me, and they did come back. Around 2 a.m., the knocks started again, but this time they were accompanied by something new. A low, raspy whisper, as if someone was trying to say my name. The voice was almost imperceptible, but I could feel it reverberating in my chest, as if it was coming from inside my own room. "Emily," the voice whispered, dragging out the syllables in a way that made me cringe. My heart raced, and I felt an intense chill run through my body. The knocks continued, each one louder than the last, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, I opened the door and looked into the hallway. The lamp at the end of the hall was flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls. At the end of the hallway, the same dark figure stood with its back to me. This time it seemed closer, as if it was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and started walking toward it. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer, but began to move again, disappearing around the corner of the hallway. I ran after it, but when I reached the end of the hall, all I saw was the bathroom door slowly closing. The doorknob stopped mid-turn, as if someone was holding it from the inside. This time I didn't shout. I knew it wasn't Thomas or Jake. Something much more sinister was happening. I pushed the bathroom door open and turned on the light. The bathroom was empty, except for the same pair of heavy black boots on the floor under one of the stalls. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy laugh, coming from inside the stall. It sounded like the laugh of an old man, but there was something unsettling about it, almost inhuman. My heart raced, and I felt a fear so intense I could barely move. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The laughter stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the stall door began to creak open slowly, the hinges rusted and groaning. I knew I should run, but I was paralyzed, unable to move. When the door finally opened completely, there was no one there. Just the boots, now aligned as if someone was standing in them. That's when the bathroom light started flickering, and the laughter returned, louder and closer this time. I felt something brush past me, like a cold hand touching my arm. I screamed and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. The knocks continued for a few more minutes, but I didn't have the courage to open the door again. That night, I knew something was wrong, and it wasn't a prank by Thomas or Jake. Something sinister was happening in the dorm, and I was at the center of it. The next morning, I was completely exhausted. The knocks, the figure in the hallway, and that eerie laughter had left me in a constant state of alert. Sarah noticed how worn out I looked during breakfast and insisted I tell her what was going on. Jake and Thomas, sitting with us, seemed genuinely concerned when I described the events of the past few nights. "This isn't normal, Emily," Sarah said, her voice filled with worry. "You need to talk to someone about this." "I already talked to you guys," I replied, frustrated. "And no one seems to know anything." Thomas looked at Jake, who just shrugged. "I swear we're not messing with you, Emily," Thomas said, his expression serious. "This sounds serious." That's when Jake suggested something I hadn't considered before. "Have you talked to Mr. Harris? He's been working here for decades. If anyone knows something about this dorm, it's him." Mr. Harris was the building's custodian, an older, reserved man who always seemed to be somewhere in the dorm, fixing something or just watching. I decided to look for him after class. I found Mr. Harris in the dorm basement, organizing some old boxes. He seemed surprised to see me, but agreed to talk when I explained what was happening. His expression changed when I mentioned the knocks, the figure in the hallway, and the black boots. "Ah, so you've seen him," Mr. Harris said, his voice low and grave. "Seen who?" I asked, my heart racing. Mr. Harris sighed, as if recalling something painful. "Many years ago, before I started working here, there was an incident in this dorm. An older man, a custodian like me, died in the third-floor bathroom. They say he wore heavy black boots and had a peculiar laugh. Some students back then swore they heard knocks on their doors and laughter in the hallway, but no one ever saw anything. Until now." I felt a chill run through my body. That story explained everything. The knocks, the figure in the hallway, the boots, and the eerie laughter. But why was he haunting me? Why did he choose me? I asked, my voice trembling. Mr. Harris looked at me with a somber expression. He always chooses someone who's alone, vulnerable, someone he can scare. But don't worry, Emily. He can't hurt you. He just wants to frighten you. That explanation didn't comfort me. In fact, it made things worse. I knew I couldn't keep living in fear, but I also didn't know what to do. I decided that if the knocks came back that night, I would face whatever was haunting me. I needed answers. That night, I was determined to confront whatever was tormenting me. Sarah insisted I sleep in her room, but I refused. I needed to find out the truth, even if it meant facing my greatest fear. Jake and Thomas promised they'd stay awake and keep an ear out, ready to help if I needed it. But deep down, I knew this was something I had to do alone. Around 2 a.m., the knocks started again. This time they were louder and more insistent than ever, as if whoever was on the other side was furious. The raspy, whispering voice returned, calling my name in a way that made my blood run cold. "Emily," the voice whispered, dragging out the syllables in a way that made me cringe. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and opened the door. The hallway was dark, with only the flickering light of the lamp at the end of the hall. At the end of the hallway, the same dark figure stood with its back to me. This time it seemed closer, as if it was waiting for me. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer, but began to move again, disappearing around the corner of the hallway. I ran after it, but when I reached the end of the hall, all I saw was the bathroom door slowly closing. The doorknob stopped mid-turn, as if someone was holding it from the inside. This time I didn't shout. I knew it wasn't Thomas or Jake. Something much more sinister was happening. I pushed the bathroom door open and turned on the light. The bathroom was empty, except for the same pair of heavy black boots on the floor under one of the stalls. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy laugh coming from inside the stall. It sounded like the laugh of an old man, but there was something unsettling about it, almost inhuman. My heart raced and I felt a fear so intense I could barely move. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The laughter stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the stall door began to creak open slowly, the hinges rusted and groaning. I knew I should run, but I was paralyzed, unable to move. When the door finally opened completely, there was no one there. Just the boots, now aligned as if someone was standing in them. That's when the bathroom light started flickering, and the laughter returned, louder and closer this time. I felt something brush past me like a cold hand touching my arm. I screamed and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. The knocks continued for a few more minutes, but I didn't have the courage to open the door again. That night, I knew something was wrong, and it wasn't a prank by Thomas or Jake. Something sinister was happening in the dorm, and I was at the center of it.